Girl's blood wasn't the first thing the night noticed. It noticed the way the man smiled while he worked. In towns like this, the dark keeps its own ledger. It watches the ones who hum through their sins, the ones who cut without trembling, the ones who think no one is listening to the way their breathing changes when they enjoy it. Folks in places like this don't whisper their legends to scare children. They whisper them to stay alive. Some of those whispers drift further than others, down old roads, across cold fields, into the headphones of the sleepless, and into a place the locals have come to call whispering narratives, where stories don't just get told, they come looking for you. And tonight, while the man's smile widened under the unfinished roof of a half-built home, the night finally turned its head toward him, because the girl's blood was just a footnote. The way he smiled was the reason. The moon stopped pretending not to watch. In the half-finished subdivision outside town, where plywood skeletons of houses waited for families that hadn't signed yet, a single floodlight burned over a raw concrete foundation. Moths flung themselves at it like they wanted to erase the scene below. A man in his 40s, builder's vest thrown over a cheap collared shirt, knelt beside the woman he'd zip-tied to a support post. His hands were steady, too steady. He hummed to himself, some tuneless thing that had never seen daylight. The moon hung low over the skeletal roofs, full and bloated, its edges smudged by a thin ring of cloud. It looked sick, wrong. The kind of wrong that made dogs whine and crawl under furniture. He made the first cut along her arm, slow, savoring it. That was when the floodlight flickered. The hum of the generator hiccuped, stuttered, then kept going. The bowl buzzed harder, halo widening, shrinking, widening again, moths scattered. The man frowned and glanced up. "Come on," he muttered. "Not tonight." He didn't see the shadow move at the edge of the construction site. Not at first, but he felt it. Something shifted in the darkness between the stacked cinder blocks and the portable toilet. No wind, no footsteps, just wait. A subtle change in the air pressure, like another presence had leaned in close enough to share breath. The woman's eyes, glassy with terror, rolled toward the far side of the lot. Her chest seized. A sound tried to claw its way up her throat and died against the tape over her mouth. The man followed her gaze, between the stacks of lumber. 2 points of amber light hovered at a height no man's shoulders could reach. They didn't glow so much as burn, like coals banked behind a lattice of black branches. The floodlight dimmed again, then flared, and for a heartbeat he saw it. Something standing upright but wrong, spine curved in a predatory arc, shoulders to broads, its outline ringed in fur that ate the light instead of reflecting it. It was there and not there, defined more by the way the darkness bent around it than by any edges his mind could accept. A low sound rolled across the lot. It didn't start in its throat. It started in the ground. A bass rumble that shook dust from the plywood frames that made nails sing in their boards. It rose up into the man's knees, his chest, his teeth, then thinned into a howl that caught on its own pitch halfway up, like it had to drag itself through fangs and bone to escape. The moths fled the floodlight dot the generator sputtered out. Moonlight hit the site full force, silver and raw, and every shadow deepened like spilled ink. Out on the highway, a dog barking, but nothing swallowed its next howl. No one in town heard the man scream. They heard the cut-off of the generator, the clatter of something metal striking concrete, the brief, wet thud of something heavy hitting a plywood wall. And far above it all, bleeding down from that swollen, sick-ringed moon, something else answered itself with a second, more distant howl. No one survives the night it chooses, not the way they were before. Far past the new houses and the old farms, the town's older lights smouldered, The people there didn't talk about what moved in the gaps between those lights, not where strangers could hear. Folks in towns like this don't whisper their legends to scare children. They whisper them to stay alive. They called the place Ashgrove, though there were more rusted trucks than trees these days. One main street, one decaying factory they still called the mill even though it hadn't turned in years. One bar with a neon wolf in the window that nobody found funny anymore. They also had one tradition city people never understood. When the moon came up full and there was a thin, dirty ring around it, the portiers went dark early. The drunks went home sober, and the sheriff's department parked a cruiser on the hill above the highway, not to watch the town, but to watch the road leading out. On nights like that, the town hoped something was coming, and hoped even harder that it wasn't coming for them. The night after the man in the subdivision didn't make it home, the town moved like it always did. That was the trick in places like Ashgrove, pretending the dread was just weather. Deputy Nora Vale pulled into the sheriff's lot with a styrofoam cup of coffee and a headache that felt like someone tapping on the back of her eye. Her tires hissed over gravel, headlights sweeping across the aging brick building. She killed the engine and sat there a moment, watching the sky bleed from bruised purple to a flat, metallic blue. The moon had dragged itself lower toward the horizon, but that ring still clung to it like a bruise. Nora rubbed at the scar along her left forearm, a pale crescent that caught the weak light. She told people it was from a dog bite, and in a way, that was true. The rest of the truth smelled like wet fur and cold iron and lived in the part of her mind that never slept. Inside the precinct hummed with stale coffee and old fluorescent light. Sheriff Harlan Pike stood over a cluttered table, grey beard bristling, a manila folder in one hand and his reading glasses in the other. He looked like someone had carved him out of the same stubborn wood as the town itself. "You're late," he said without looking up. "You're early," she shot back, hanging her jacket. "We switching to farmer's hours now." "Moon's wrong," Pike said. "Town feels it." Nora followed his gaze to the wall where the call logs were pinned up. 3 livestock reports from the North Farms, a missing dog, a break-in at the edge of the new subdivision. The night had chewed through the town in little bites. "What happened out by Ridgeview?" Nora asked. Pike opened the folder. Crime scene photos caught the light. Concrete, plywood, a spray of something dark enough that the black and white print didn't need color to make its point. "They're calling it a construction accident up the chain for now," Pike said. "Generator blew, man got caught in it. At least that's what out of town's going to hear." "And what do we hear?" Pike slid one photo toward her. A concrete floor, rough and unfinished. In the center of it, a wide smear that might once have been a man. But it wasn't the blood that drew the eye. It was the gouge marks, starting near the smear and tearing outward toward the edge of the slab. 4 parallel trenches had been carved into the concrete, deep enough to catch shadow. They weren't straight like tool marks. They curved, then hooked inward at the ends. Like whatever made them had dug in for purchase. Nora's fingers tightened around the coffee cup. "No animal we've got does that," Pike said quietly. "No human tool I know makes that pattern by accident." "How's Ridgeview explaining it?" "Defective batch of concrete," Pike said dryly. "Stress fracture. They'll have an engineer say it into a microphone." Nora stared at the photo behind it, behind the stale coffee smell and Pike's exhausted rage. Something older shifted in her memory. Wet breath on the back of her neck, the sound of claws trying to find purchase on rock. A hand that wasn't a hand anymore, snapping zip tees like they were strands of spaghetti. She cleared her throat. "You think it's one of those nights?" "It's been one of those nights for 30 years, Pike said. "Some just shout louder than others." He gathered the photos, slid them back into the folder, then hesitated. We might have company. Nora frowned. Company? Pike jerked his head toward the front window. A dark sedan sat parked across the street. Not local. The paint was too clean, the plates too fresh. Leaning against the hood, arms folded, was a man in an FBI windbreaker. Another stood beside him, thinner eyes lost in the glare of his phone. Serial, Pike said. The bureau's been chasing somebody they don't talk about in briefings. Guy who moves from town to town picking lonely houses and lonely girls. Every step he takes, he leaves a trail of calls and credit cards and cameras. And then he comes here, Nora finished. Pike nodded. Or somewhere just outside of here. They always wander close. You know that. Nora did know. The file names changed, the faces changed, but the pattern didn't. A predator smelling out a place where the rules bent differently. A place where monsters vanished. Open loop, the profiler in her head whispered. New thread in the food chain. You going to talk to them? She asked. In a bit, Pike said. Let them sweat. People like that aren't used to being the ones waiting. He glanced at the moon through the narrow window and something like pity crossed his face. Not for the agents, for whatever they were chasing. Ask the locals about that night. They'll look away before answering, he said, almost to himself. Nora followed him into the briefing room, Scar itching. Outside, as if on cue, a dog started barking down on Alder Street, frantic, hypered. The barking stopped, like a switch had been thrown. Nora didn't realize she was holding her breath until her lungs burned. If this reminds you of something you've heard, you're not alone. She took a seat, the old plastic chair creaking beneath her, and waited for the night to line up its pieces. It never took long. Not in ASHGROVE. The man from the bureau introduced himself as Special Agent Keller. Late 30s, expensive haircut, the kind of restless intelligence in his eyes that had never quite learned to sleep. His partner, Singh, stood beside him like a shadow quieter, but watching everything. Keller spread out his own photos on the table. Different victims, different half-finished basements, motel rooms, highway pull-offs. Same hands, same kind of smile caught in a reflection, a gas station camera, a passing car's dash cam. The press doesn't know this is one person, Keller said. They have different names for him depending on the state. We have one name. We call him the contractor. Cute, Pike said flatly. Keller didn't rise to it. He scopes out developments, abandoned builds, places where no one should be after dark, where the sound of a generator or a scream just blends into the distance. He picks girls nobody will look for fast enough. He takes his time, and then he moves on. Except he didn't move on this time, Nora said, eye on the photos. Keller laid down the last picture. Concrete, plywood, a smear, and claw gouges. The locals got to the scene before we did, Keller said carefully. We were told it was a freak equipment failure, and there was nothing to see. But my job is patterns, and out of 9 known scenes, this is the only one where he didn't have time to clean. Singh slid a thin file toward them. We've had anomalies chasing his trail for a while now. Witnesses who say they heard howling where no dogs live. Doorways torn open in ways bolt cutters can't explain. We've chalked it up to local flair, fear, exaggeration, but, Pike prompted. But Ashgrove has its own file, Singh said. Separate drawer, different color tab. It goes back decades. Hikers disappearing near the ridge. Hunters coming back, white-haired from one night in the woods. People like him. He nodded at the contractor's photo. People whose urges don't fit in a courtroom. They come through here, and they don't leave the way they expected to. Pike's jaw tightened. Maybe they finally found somewhere they couldn't treat like a playground. Keller's eyes flicked up. You? No more than you've written down, Sheriff. That much is obvious. We're not here to step on toes. We're here because our bogeyman walked into your legend. And now we've got a crime scene that looks like a combine thresher met a bear trap. I'd like to know what, exactly, your town keeps whispering about. The room seemed to shrink. Around the question, fluorescent light hummed. A fly battered itself against the bulb. And somewhere, deep in the building, pipes groaned. Nora watched Pike. He looked at the photos, at the agents, Nora's scar, almost unconsciously. Then he sighed, the sound of a man paying an old debt. Every forest has something at the top of the chain, he said. Most places, it's a man with a gun. Here the stories disagree. Keller folded his arms. You think there's something out there cleaning up your problems? A wild dog, a rogue bear, vigilante. I think there's something, Pike said, and I think it doesn't tolerate competition. He nodded toward the window, where the rim of the wrong moon glared pale in the daylight haze. Locals say the moon never glows the same after that night, he added. Not if you've seen what walks under it when it's ringed like that. Keller's skepticism flickered, but didn't go out. Let's say I humor you. Let's say there's some apex predator out there. I still need something I can write in a report that isn't Monster 8 our suspect. So how about this? You take us to where your stories live. We'll bring our guns. You bring whatever it is you bring on nights like this. Nora's scar flared cold. There was a rule in Ashgrove, an unspoken one. You didn't invite outsiders into the woods on ringed moon nights. But another rule had started to grow in the back of her mind over the years, rooted in the memory of a basement, a chain, and a pair of eyes that glowed amber as they snapped, a killing blow short. If something was out there hunting monsters, maybe it needed to know when bigger ones were coming. Attention reset, the story whispered. New threat meets older one. Pike drew a slow breath. The decision weighed more than his badge. All right, he said. But you do exactly what I say. No grandstanding, no heroics. Whatever you think you know about predators, forget it. You're about to see where the food chain actually ends. They waited until the edges of the day had thinned into bruise-colored twilight. Ashgrove was the kind of place where the sky seemed closer than it should be. Clouds dragged low, snagging on the ridge above town like old cotton. The woods beyond, the new subdivision, had been clear-cut once, long ago, then allowed to grow back feral. Saplings had become crooked teenagers of trees, their branches knitting together overhead in arthritic conspiracies. The ground was a tangle of roots and old stone. Trail ends here, Pike said, killing the engine of the cruiser at the mouth of the access road. The air that seeped in through the vents was colder than it should have been for the season. Keller checked his sidearm, the motion practiced. Singh shouldered a shotgun with the grim attention of someone who'd seen enough. Morgs to know better than to underestimate anything. Nora stepped out, boots crunching gravel. The smell hit her first, damp earth oil. A faint iron tang that never really went away in places where too much blood had soaked the ground above them. The moon hauled itself back into the sky like a tired god. The ring around it was clearer, now a dim halo that didn't belong to any weather pattern Nora had learned in school. They moved in single file. Pike in front, then Keller, Nora, Singh watching their backs. Flashlights cut narrow spears of light through the trees, carving the shadows into moving murals. How far? Keller asked. Far enough that town can pretend not to hear, Pike said. Close enough that it can't pretend long. They passed a tree with bark scored deep, 4 parallel lines running from my height down to the base. Nora's stomach rolled. Keller stopped, running his hand along one of the grooves. "Bear?" he asked. "If that helps you walk," Pike said. "Sure." The path narrowed, forcing them closer. The forest pressed in, holding its breath. Nora could feel it as a physical presence. Now that sense of being measured, weighed, the way a good hunter looked at a herd and decided where the weakness lay. It wasn't just watching the agents, it was watching her. Her scar throbbed in time with her heartbeat. Memory rose, unwanted and slick, chains rattling. A man in a stained shirt holding a knife, too calmly. A younger Nora bound to a chair, the copper taste of a gag in her mouth. Basement air thick with mildew and bleach. And then, above it all, the sound of something heavy on the stairs. Not the measured tread of a man, the 4-point rhythm of something on too many limbs. Asterisk. The contractor's spiritual predecessor had picked the wrong town back then too. He had not walked out of Ashgrove either. The memory unspooled, the door crashing inward, the killer's curses, cut short by a sound like wet branches snapping. The smell for blood, cold, eyes in the dark, meeting hers, testing, choosing the chain around her chair breaking. A hot breath at her neck and the quiet, animal judgment in it. A warning, not a promise. "You all right?" Singh murmured behind her. Nora forced her shoulders down. "Fine," she lied. Ahead, the trees opened into a shallow ravine. The ground dipped. Rocks jutted from the earth like broken teeth. At the center of the hollow lay what was left of an older campfire ring, blackened stones, a scattering of beer cans half swallowed by moss and claw marks. Everywhere the rocks were raked with grooves. The nearest tree bore scars higher than Keller's head. The ground itself looked like something had tested its strength there over and over, carving trenches where its weight had landed. Nora's flashlight slid over a darker stain in the earth. Old, long, dried, soaked deep. "Jesus," Keller whispered. "This is territory," Pike said softly. "You wanted to see where the legends live, Agent. This is as close as you get and still go home." A sound drifted through the ravine then, not loud, not dramatic. Just a single, wet exhale, like a bellows being squeezed in the dark. It came from everywhere at once. Keller snapped his gun up. Singh pivoted, shotgun following his flashlight beam. "Easy," Pike said. "Don't wave those around unless you plan to fire. And if you fire, make sure it's at the right thing. You don't want to find out what happens if you shoot the wrong side tonight." "Wrong side of what?" Keller hissed. The moon hauled itself over the lip of the ravine. Clouds shredded around it, not drifting past so much as being pushed aside. Its light struck the center of the hollow, turning the old fire ring into a pale, skeletal circle. Nora heard it before. She saw it. Bones shifting, muscles pulling against themselves, the wet, tearing sound of flesh rearranging at the far edge of the ravine. A shape pulled itself out of the shadows on all fours, then rose, unfolding too far. Its spine snapped, and, reformed, vertebrae bulging, shoulders swelling under a sultan pepper pelt marred by old scars. Fingers lengthened into claws that flexed, cutting crescents into the air. Its head lifted last, jaw cracking wide, snout pushing forward like something underneath had finally stopped pretending to be human. Teeth caught the moonlight, long, uneven. Brutal tools meant not just to kill, but to rip. Its eyes opened, amber, yes, but not the flat glow of an animal. They burned with a vicious, targeted intelligence, recognition, calculation. The werewolf stepped fully into the light, a silhouette mid-transformation, caught between wolf and man, haloed in silver. Its breath fogged the air. Every exhale smelled like iron and old leaves. Ella swore, every rational bone in his body trying to crawl out through his skin. No, No, that's real, Nora's body informed him. Real and bigger than the stories. I'm watching you decide whether you're prey. The wolf's gaze slid over Singh, lingered on Keller's shaking gun, then found Nora. It paused. Something passed between them in that moment. Recognition. Memory of a basement and a broken chain. It tilted its head, ears pricking, and for an instant its lips curled back, not in a snarl, but in what, horrifyingly, could have been the ghost of a smirk. Then it looked past her, up toward the ridge. Something else moved there, another presence, smaller. Two dash-legged the contractors stood at the top of the ravine, clothes different, posture the same. He held a girl tight in front of him, one arm a lock across her throat, the other holding a knife glittering at her ribs. How he'd approach without them hearing, Nora couldn't say. Predators knew how to move around other predators, especially when they thought the other one was focused elsewhere. Put the guns down, the contractor called, his voice bright and too cheerful, or I start drawing pictures on her lungs. Keller swung his gun toward the new threat. The werewolf's ears flattened. Nora saw it like a series of crime scene photos. Man, girl, knife, moon, claw marks in concrete, old cases whose files had simply stopped. You people are terrible at bait, the contractor went on. But I appreciate the effort, dragging me right to your little local nightmare. He nodded toward the werewolf. I've been hearing you in my dreams, you know. Was wondering what kind of dog you were. The wolf's lips peeled back now. For real, every tooth a promise. This whole place is wrong. The contractor mused, tightening his grip on the girl as she whimpered. Lights go out at the same time. Folks walk faster past alleys. And every now and then, someone like me just disappears. I had to come see who thought they were top of the food chain. Nora's heart hammered. Her scar burned. She realized, with a nauseating twist, what the night had done. The town hadn't baited the wolf. The wolf had used the town, used its patterns, its legends, its soft talk about monsters vanishing to cultivate a rumor. A rumor that would draw something like the contractor here. Predator baiting, predator. The girl's eyes rolled, wild. Blood slicked the knife's edge where it had already broken skin. Let her go, Keller barked. Now. Oh, you're adorable, the contractor said. You think this is about her? He pressed the blade against her harder, making her gasp. This is about that. He jerked his chin toward the werewolf. You know how hard it is to find something in this world that looks at you and doesn't see man. That sees right through to the hunger underneath. I wanted to know what that felt like. He laughed, short and sharp. Turns out, I don't like it. The werewolf took a step forward. The ravine shifted with its weight. Stones rolled. The air thickened. Shoot it, Singh whispered. Before it shoot what? Pike snapped. The thing that's been making sure men like him don't get careers in our county. Sheriff, Keller snarled. That is a wild animal. It's the only reason some of us are still breathing. Pike said. The wolf moved again, each step a study in controlled power. Its gaze skimmed over the girl, then locked on the contractor, pinning him where he stood. In that stare, Keller finally saw it. Not a rabid beast, not a mindless thing, but an executioner. One that had been walking its route for longer than any of them had been alive. The contractor saw it too, and in his eyes, for the first time in the trail of photos and files, real fear bloomed. He shoved the girl forward, between himself and the beast. Back off, he hissed, or I spill her and we see which one of us gets there first. Attention reset. Stakes redrawn. The girl stumbled, feet sliding on loose earth. The werewolf could have torn around her in a heartbeat. Instead, it stopped. Muscles bunched. Claws dug deeper. Nora understood. It wasn't unwilling to risk her life. It was unwilling to give the contractor the thrill. Something old in it refused to feed that particular hunger. The forest held its breath. Then the night chose. The moon broke through the last rag of cloud, blasting the ravine with raw white light. For a heartbeat, everything froze in sharp relief. The girl's bare arms, the spray of dirt under her feet, the knife flashing near her ribs, the wolf's fur standing on end, each strand rimmed in silver. The contractor flinched, eyes squeezing, shut against the brightness. The werewolf moved. It crossed the distance in a blur, not toward the girl, but past her. One clawed hand snapped out, faster than a thought, catching the knife at the blade. Flesh split, blood flew. The knife spun into the dark as if yanked by invisible teeth. The other hand closed around the contractor's throat. The girl dropped to her knees, gasping. Keller lunged, dragging her backward, hauling her towards Singh and the dubious safety of their guns. The contractor clawed at the paw that held him, legs kicking. His face turned purple, then a mottled, ugly red. The wolf lifted him off the ground, effortlessly, like a misbehaving pup. "You can arrest him!" Keller shouted, voice cracking. We can take him in. We need him alive." The werewolf looked at the agent, nostrils flaring. It inhaled deeply, as if considering the scent behind the words. The thin, sharp odor of bureaucracy, the cold, metallic tang of prisons, the stale, moldy reek of monsters tucked away where no one ever really looked at them. Then it turned its head, ever so slightly, toward Nora. Its eyes asked a question she'd spent her whole life avoiding. Was the world better with this man breathing in it? Not hypothetically, not in a courtroom with lawyers and evidence and appeals, in blood, right here, right now. Nora saw herself in the mirrored surface of the contractor's pupils, younger, bound, bleeding. She saw the faces of the girls in Keller's photos. She saw the fear in the girls sobbing into Singh's coat. She thought of the town, of the way porch lights went out on ringed moon nights, of the unspoken relief when the news from elsewhere carried stories that ended with no further information available. She also thought of what it meant to be human, of lines, of laws, of the thin fence they'd tried to build around their own savage urges. The fence had never been for things like the contractor. It had been for people like her. Her scar burned like a brand. She didn't nod. She didn't raise her gun. She simply didn't speak. Silence, in that moment, became a verdict. The werewolf's claws clenched. There wasn't much sound. Just a wet, final crunch, like someone snapping a dried twig. The contractor's body spasmed once, then went limp. The wolf held him there, head lolling, for a long, terrible second. Then it opened its hand. The body fell into the old fire ring, landing among the blackened stones. For a heartbeat, the world held still. Then the werewolf did something none of them expected. It stepped back from the corpse. It turned away from what it had done and looked at the girl. She huddled behind Keller's legs, shaking. Blood smeared her face. Her eyes were wide, pupils blown with shock. The wolf lowered its head. It inhaled. Nora felt the hairs rise along her arms. This was the test. Predator evaluating potential predator. The scent of trauma and fear and future choices. The wolf's ears flicked back. It huffed once, dismissive. Not this one. Its gaze returned to Nora. It held her there, pinned to the center of the ravine, mind replaying every choice she'd ever made that had nudged her closer to one edge or another. Then, slowly, it inclined, its head a nod, a recognition of something shared, of a night years ago in another basement, when it had spared a girl who might have gone either way. Then it turned its back on all of them. No battle roar, no victory pose. It simply walked toward the shadows at the edge of the ravine, each step an assertion of ownership over the ground. As it moved, its body shifted again. Fur receded, bones rolled beneath skin. The hulking shape narrowed, shrank. By the time it reached the tree line, it was something more like a man, a gentle, scarred, wrapped in the shreds of clothes that had once been whole. It didn't look back. A moment later, it was gone, swallowed by the dark. The moon dimmed, as if relieved its work was done. The official report read like any other horror made palatable for daylight. The contractor had slipped, fallen into his own fire pit during a struggle. The girl had been rescued thanks to the brave intervention of local law enforcement and federal agents. There were no witnesses willing to testify otherwise. No one wrote about the claw marks. No one wrote about the way the moon looked different for days afterward. More distant somehow, as if whatever shared custody it had over this town's nights had just been renegotiated. Ashgrove went back to pretending. Porch lights went out a little earlier when the moon wore its ring. Dogs still barked at unseen things every so often. News filtered in from other places. Names of men who had been hurting others for years. Men with basements, with woods, with motel keys, with smiles that never reached their eyes. Sometimes those news stories ended with arrests, trials, sentences. Sometimes they ended with one line: authorities are no longer pursuing additional leads. At this time, Nora read each one. She thought of the ravine, of the old fire ring filled with more than ashes. She thought of the way the werewolf had looked at her, weighing, measuring, choosing. Ashgrove had a predator of predators. It had chosen its role, and for now, it had chosen not to turn its teeth on those who walked the line and tried to keep their own hungers leashed. For now, ask the locals about that night. They'll look away before answering, but if you stand on the ridge above town on a ringed moon night, if you listen past the wind in the distant highway, you can sometimes hear two howls instead of one. One deep and old, claiming its territory. The other younger, answering, not in challenge, but in recognition. Locals say the moon never glows the same after that night. They're right, because once you know something is out there hunting the monsters you never see in court, you can't look at any full moon without wondering who it's watching now. And if your windows rattle just a little when the howling starts, maybe that's not the wind. Maybe that's the night, checking which side of the story you're on. If you're still listening, the night hasn't let you go yet. Stories like this don't end when the last word lands. They keep moving, slipping into alleys, settling into the corners of your room where the light doesn't quite reach. They follow you from screen to window, from sky to reflection, asking the same quiet question. If something hunted the worst of us, would you sleep easier or not at all? If any part of this felt like a rumor you already knew, a case that vanished, a howl you heard in a place with no dogs, a town that closes its doors a little too early on full moon nights, leave your mark where others can find it. Warnings don't always look like signs on the road. Sometimes they're just words left behind by someone who saw the same shadow. There are more nights like this. More legends that walk on all fours and stand on two legs when they want to look you in the eye. If you stay close to the places where these stories gather, you might hear the next howl before it reaches your street. Just remember, once you start following the trail of things that hunt hunters, the trail has a way of following you back. Sleep if you can, listen if you can't. The moon is already choosing its next name, and it never forgets the ones who stay until the final breath of the story. If something in the dark stirred while you listened, if a part of you leaned forward when the howling began, leave a word behind so others know they aren't alone. In the woods, stories like this travel through the world like scent on cold air, and whispering narratives is where the ones that matter come to roost. If you felt the night tighten around you as this tale closed, step closer, stay with the pack, and let the next story find you before the next full moon rises. Because once the moon marks you, it expects you to return. Subscribe before the next full moon. It's safer that way.